1989 Montreal massacre. A young man walked into one of the first-year classrooms, asked all the men to leave, and then murdered 14 women, turned the gun on himself, and took his own life.
Both men and women are struggling.
The vast majority of the victims of sextortion in Canada are boys and young men.
Are you winning this battle?
Humberto Carolo is a global expert in gender-based violence prevention and CEO of White Ribbon. Known for engaging men and boys in advancing gender equality, he has decades of experience advising governments, UN agencies, and organizations worldwide.
During COVID, the rates of violence against women increased significantly. We saw a 30% increase in the number of calls to police and emergency services from women who were experiencing this violence. 82% of parents do not understand the Manosphere, do not understand these hateful kind of ideologies.
Just toss these guys in prison, get them away as far and wide as possible.
Doesn't work. We're at risk of turning a whole generation of vulnerable boys and young men into hateful, violent individuals. The problem continues.
What's the solution here?
The first step is to, first of all,
we find it very interesting that the majority of you who watch and listen to this show aren't yet subscribed to our channels across Spotify, Apple, YouTube. It would mean the world to us if you can do us that small kindness. It allows us to continue to bring on amazing guests week after week and continue to provide you with amazing value and content. It's the only thing we'll ever ask of you. If you can hit that follow or subscribe button, it would mean the world to us. Thank you so much and enjoy the episode. Humberto.
yes.
I pronounced it right.
Yes.
Yes.
Got it. Yeah.
Welcome to Gent's Talk.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to have this conversation. Excited, worried, fascinated, kind of all the range of emotions because we have a problem in our society.
Yes.
Especially with young people. Both men and women are struggling. But for anyone who doesn't know who you are and what White Ribbon is, the organization that you work with, what do you guys do?
So White Ribbon started 2 years after the December 6, 1989 Montreal massacre, where a young man walked into l'École Polytechnique in Montreal with his heart and mind full of hate, hating women. He walked into one of the first-year classrooms, asked all the men to leave, and then murdered 14 women. And injured many others. And while he was doing this, he was yelling, "I hate women, I hate feminism," and he turned the gun on himself and took his own life before emergency services arrived. So White Ribbon was created in the aftermath of that tragedy over 30 years ago now, by three men in Toronto who felt that men weren't being part of the conversation, weren't stepping up and talking about and having the dialogue about this horrific incident that happened, and invited men to be part of the solution, right? To break their silence, to see this as an issue that they too could be involved with and speak out about, and because often men don't see themselves as part of this of the solution to this problem, right? So they created White Ribbon. They created the symbol, the pledge for men and boys to never commit, condone, or remain silent about violence against women, about all forms of gender-based violence and discrimination. So White Ribbon is a charity organization created in Toronto and Canada that is focused on promoting healthy masculinities, inviting men and boys to be part of the solution to end all forms of gender-based violence and discrimination. While doing that, helping to also improve their own lives in terms of shedding, stereotypes and harmful norms that have been part of our upbringing since the beginning. So that's what the organization is about. It started in Toronto and it spread across the world because people felt really connected to the issue, and millions of men have stepped forward now and have been part of this movement to engage men to be part of the solution in an condemning all forms of gender-based violence.
And you're the CEO.
I'm the CEO. I started with White Ribbon 20 years ago on the front lines, and I've been with the organization since. And today I'm so honored to lead this movement and do this kind of work.
Congrats on that.
Thank you.
Lifetime of work there.
Thank you.
So I want to ask you a question. I want you to take off your CEO hat for a second. Being someone who's now been there for 20 years, are you winning this battle? Honestly?
You know, I think there have been some good changes. And the good changes are the fact that as a society, we're a lot more aware of this problem. I think in the aftermath of the Me Too movement, there was a significant increase in consciousness, in awareness about this issue, and people are talking about it. Media is paying a lot more attention to these issues. You know, workplaces, institutions are having to address this in new ways than they were before. So from that point of view, things have changed, but the problem continues. You know, the root causes of this problem haven't been properly addressed, haven't ended, and we continue to struggle to, you know, address this issue in different ways and get ahead of it. The rates are still pretty high. Young people, boys are getting involved in this kind of violence in new ways through technology, online, and we're really concerned, and things need to change, and we all need to step up and be part of that change.
You said the word root problems. What is that? What's the root problem of the type of violence that we're seeing today?
So we know that the root causes are ingrained in the types of discrimination that exist in our society. The fact that for centuries now, women and men have been treated differently. Women have been treated as subservient to men, right? With men having control for the most part and dominance over many aspects of women's lives. So the root causes stem from that, but we also know that the root causes of this violence have to do with how boys and young men are socialized from a very young age to always be in control, to dominate, to never back down, to express only certain kinds of emotions. You know, where anger is the only emotion that boys and young men are allowed to experience without judgment, without, you know, being called names and so forth. We know that those kinds of norms have a significant impact on men's and young men's ability to deal with their own emotions, and then they turn to violence, to control and dominance, to get their needs met, to deal with their stresses and their crisis in their lives, and that is what leads to then their use of violence towards women and girls, towards people around them.
How prevalent of a problem is that still today?
It's pretty significant. You know, we know that, for example, during COVID, the rates of violence against women increased significantly in Canada and around the world. You know, we saw a 30% increase in the number of calls to police and emergency services from women who were experiencing this violence. There was an uprise in that violence because, as we were told to stay in place, you know, to lock down, you know, we were living in more confined spaces, and the stresses, the crisis that pandemic created in people's lives, in our homes, increased that violence significantly. So we know when there are situations, downturns in economy, when there's unemployment, when there is lack of access to those basic needs, that it increases the levels of stress in people's lives, and women and children in particular bear the brunt of that crisis, right? And men are not always capable, are not always equipped to deal with their own emotions in healthy ways, and they resort to violence and control and dominance, again, to have their needs met.
I have so many questions.
Mm-hmm.
This is obviously still a very prevalent problem in Canada and North America, across the globe.
Right across.
So what's the solution here? How do you, like you talked about young boys growing up in a certain ideology, let's say.
Yeah.
Taught to behave a certain way, reprimanded if they don't. If they don't subscribe to a certain version of masculinity that's been prevalent now for decades and generations. They're reprimanded by society, other men in their lives, by some women.
Yeah.
How do you fight that? How do you change that?
We have to raise our boys and young men differently than we have been up to now, right? We have to pay close attention to how those gender stereotypes and expectations are being, ingrained into young people's lives right from the beginning, right? So we call on parents, in particular dads, to role model healthier ways of being, right? To role model, their full selves, their authentic selves, without holding back their emotions. Often boys are taught from a very young age not to cry because, crying is a sign of weakness. And so they're told, grow up, be a man, stop crying, stop showing any sort of emotions that are deemed or perceived as weak. So we have to shed those stereotypes from our lives and from how we raise boys and young men, because if we're raising those boys to suppress a wide range of their own emotions, then we're limiting how they're able to then later on deal with crisis and stresses in their lives. And if anger is the only thing that we teach them that is okay for them to express, then that's going to come out in their relationships later on. So we have to raise boys and young men differently. We also have to look at our own behaviors and attitudes as adults, our different role in our different roles as fathers, as family members, as brothers, as co-workers, and make sure that we are not behaving in those kinds of limiting ways, that we use the full range of our emotions to talk about our feelings and our what's bothering us and so forth, so that we are being more authentic and we're better equipped to deal with the stresses of today's life and work and community and so forth, because we see that play out in people's lives in very negative and detrimental ways, not just for the women who are disproportionately on the receiving end of those kinds of behaviors and attitudes, but for other men around us and for ourselves too, because if we can't be our authentic selves, then we're also repressing our own emotions, our own mental well-being, and that's not good for us either. So we gotta start challenging those norms and those stereotypes. We gotta start shedding them from our lives and our interactions, and we gotta start educating our boys and young men and girls as well to make sure that they're not incorporating those stereotypes into their lives. So we got to also teach them about the risks, the harms that exist out there in the world, particularly in online spaces, that are drawing boys and young men into those ideologies that are about promoting those harmful aspects of being, those gender stereotypes, those toughen up kind of messages. Be a man, always in control, always dominate, always get what you want, you deserve what you need, and so forth. We need to help boys and young men understand from the get-go that those kinds of messages are really harmful to themselves and to those around them.
I want to play devil's advocate a moment.
Yeah.
A lot of men that I work with, talk to, hang out with, men in my own life, men I meet through events and whatnot, whenever we engage in these kinds of conversations, typically, at least in my experience, most men understand this. And most men agree with this. Where I find resistance is when men say that they feel defensive when their masculinity gets attacked for simply being masculine.
Yeah.
For simply saying, I have ambition. For simply saying, I want to go work out and I want to get bigger and stronger.
Yeah.
And I want to maintain confidence and I want to go meet a whole bunch of women and I want to do this and this and I want to make a lot of money. There's nothing wrong with that.
No.
And I think that's maybe where sometimes the messaging gets lost, is that you can be a strong, physically strong, an emotionally strong and capable, confident man in all areas of your life without having to resort to emotional dominance or physical dominance over another human being. Why is that message so easily getting lost in the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, notice that during this conversation so far, I haven't said that masculinity is bad or that it's toxic or that we should stop, being masculine. It's not about that, right? It's those stereotypes and those norms that are harmful that we grow up with, right? It's not about masculinity. It's about those harmful teachings, those expectations, those stereotypes that are placed in our lives. And they're not good for us. So we can be strong, we can be confident, we can have ambitions and amazing goals. We can all work towards that. But as part of that as well, it means that we need to be strong emotionally speaking. And to be strong emotionally speaking means expressing a full range of emotions and not just anger. Let's not show our strength only by expressing anger. Let's show our strength by expressing empathy and compassion and good listening skills and being good allies to people who are hurting, who've experienced harm or pain, right? Those are really strong. Those are really good signs of strength as well. So why is it that as men, so many men think of strength as just like removing all of those, emotions from their lives that they feel are, weak? We gotta shed that from our own lives because those emotions are necessary. They're actually quite needed in order for us to be able to build those other aspects of our strength, right? Strength of character, like to be good human beings, to be good partners, good dads, good co-workers. Like those are forms of strength as well. And if we can do that in compassionate ways, in empathetic ways, in being good role models for the young people in our lives, treating people with respect and seeing others as equals, right? Not dominate, not control in harmful ways, then those are all signs of strength. And it's good for us. And as far as I'm concerned, that's what masculinity is about. So it's not about, we're not asking men to shed their masculinity. Absolutely not. We're just asking men to open themselves up to a fuller, healthier, more encompassing, right, much more emotionally intelligent kind of masculinity. It's good for us. It's good for our lives and for our well-being too.
Absolutely.
If we do that.
And I completely agree with you. I think in practicality, there's a challenge in terms of how this actually plays out. And I was thinking to a point you made earlier about, in economic downturns or, global pandemics, there's so many different variables that can exist that can force a man to shut down. And I'm thinking about, for example, in today's society, and I want to ask you about feminism and the role that women play in this in this calculation, because there is a significant role that women play here.
Absolutely.
But I'm thinking about it from the lens of conversations I've had with young men where they'll say something like, I just graduated, there's no jobs, and the jobs that do exist don't pay enough, and the ones that do pay, it's so expensive just to live. I can't afford to buy a car and a house and take my date out for a nice fancy dinner. I can't save up for a big wedding. I can't do this, and this. And it feels like I'm less than. I feel like I'm incapable of being a provider. I'm incapable of looking after my partner, supporting my partner, because I could barely take care of myself.
Yeah.
And then when you go online and you see these male performative influencers saying, hey, if you're not making $1 million and driving a Bugatti and living on an island sipping cocktails at 2 p.m, you've somehow failed as a man. And that's where all of their friends are hanging out online, listening to these people, talking to each other in the comment section of someone else's Instagram post. 2 different realities these young men are living. One that's online and one that's baked in reality, and they're fighting each other. How do you talk to those young men? How do you support those young men? Because that's why I think they're finding themselves so attracted to the Andrew Tates of the world. Yeah. Because they're saying to them, hey, I see the shit that you're in. I see how your life sucks. Here's how I can help you. Yeah. And they go, okay, well, here's this really charismatic, jacked dude who's surrounded by beautiful women, driving amazing cars, living on an island with loads of money around. Who doesn't want that? Yeah. And so there's suddenly a path forward for them, because the alternative is being told to shut up and go to work and get a job and make something of your life. And they're like, well, we're trying and we can't.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first step is to, first of all, validate those feelings that, yes, that in particular young men and young women too experience these economic downturns in really difficult ways, right? So that is a reality of life. And I think as a society, we need to do a better job to help our young people who are going through those kinds of experiences, right? We need to look at, how can we better prepare youth after, from graduating from university, even high school, if they're not able to get into university or college, right? So what kinds of programs do we need to put in place and improve in order to address those issues in a different way than we are right now? So I think we need to validate those experiences and say we have to do a better job in putting those kinds of programs in place. But we also have to look deeper at that kind of messaging, that kind of ideology that young men in particular are being exposed to, and look at the intentions behind that. Those kinds of influencers, they're trying to make money. They're behaving in a way that is drawing people into their message, into their channels, because the more folks that follow them, the more clicks they get, the more money they make. So it is really a pyramid scheme. And what we need to consider is that those kinds of goals, what they're talking about is a fantasy. It's unattainable for the vast majority of young people. They themselves have been able to amass all of that wealth and those cars and the fame and everything because of those kinds of pyramid schemes. So young people are being tricked. They're being groomed into believing that is the kind of goal and reality that they should live up to, when in fact it's deeply harmful, because as those folks are sharing those kinds of messages, they're also sharing very misogynistic, very hateful kind of under messaging that, helping or thinking that they're helping young men get ahead by suppressing others, by dominating others, by controlling others, by often using violence towards women and raping women and getting their way. Like, what good is that for? Like, that does not advance anybody's well-being. In fact, we see that kind of messaging, those kinds of ideologies, as putting the lives of boys and young men at higher risk for failure, for using violence, for being groomed and radicalized into these ideologies that do not serve them in any way, that actually make things even worse for them. Now, do we need to have alternatives to those voices? Absolutely. And that's part of the work that we do. We gotta, help men, adults step up and share messages of support, of validation, of empathy for young men and boys, but steering them in a different kind of direction than these kinds of hateful ideology influencers are steering our young men in.
Considering these young men are spending so much time online, a charity organization like White Ribbon or any other charity organization is not going to have the same type of virality online that some of these other male influencers would have, these performative masculine personalities. Yeah. So if that's where the majority of young men are spending their time, and the charities and the organizations and the good-spirited and good-hearted individuals who are trying to help these young men they're not figuring out that algorithm.
Yeah.
How do you win this battle? Like, how do you fight this war?
So we're not able to have a similar kind of presence online because we don't have the resources, the kind of resources that these influencers have been able to amass, by exploiting young, vulnerable people who are paying, to do these courses, who are bait clicking into their advertisement kind of schemes, right? We don't have access to that kind of to those kinds of resources to be able to amplify, to be able to do the kind of work that we need to do in those spaces. So we need the support of the tech industry, right? The tech sector needs to have a better look at how their platforms are being used, because nobody wants their platforms or their businesses to be used to harm other people. So they have to change that around, and they have to provide access to organizations like White Ribbon so that we can do that kind of work, that we can meet those boys and young men where they're at, and we can share the empathy, the compassion, and support them in a different kind of way than these influencers are supposedly supporting them. They're not supporting them, they're harming them. They're radicalizing these young men into really, really harmful type of situations where they start using, we're seeing a significant increase of use of hateful ideologies, attitudes, behaviors, and often violence in real life from young men and boys, younger and younger these days, who are starting to bring those kinds of hateful ideologies into their schools, into their homes, into their communities. We're seeing that reflected in the number of cases of young people being arrested, not just in Canada, but in the United States and around the world, at younger and younger ages these days, that are being radicalized by those kinds of influences, those kinds of ideologies. So we need to get in there. We need the kind of supports to be able to meet young people where they're at in those spaces, to support them in different ways.
I'm going to play devil's advocate again. I'm one of these male influencers, and I say to you, I hear you, but you're now infringing on my free speech, which is an argument I'm hearing quite often these days. And if I'm the tech platform, who am I to regulate people's free speech? And on top of that, just so we're speaking plainly, these influencers are driving clicks and engagement and views and time on site and all these things. So why would I do any of this? Why would I change any of this?
Well, I think as a society, we need to weigh the balance between freedom for that kind of speech, which is hateful and very damaging speech, with the need to provide spaces that are safe for young people to engage in. There's got to be a better balance, because right now that's really imbalanced, and we're seeing the effects of that kind of imbalance on real life, with younger people, boys and young men, getting radicalized younger and younger, and turning from those kinds of listening and believing in those kinds of hateful ideologies online into criminal actions in real life. Is that what we want? Is that the kind of impact that we want from that kind of freedom of speech? I don't think we do. We're at risk of turning a whole generation of vulnerable boys and young men into hateful, violent individuals. We need to ask ourselves, as dads, as brothers, as Canadians, as citizens, if that is what we want to see in our world. And for me, clearly, that's not what I want to see. I want to see people who engage in that kind of radicalization and promoting those kinds of ideologies being held accountable, because we've gone down this road of promoting hate in the past. We know what comes as a result of that hatred. Right? We know the dire circumstances and the consequences of allowing that kind of hatred to continue. So is that what we want? We want our society to go in that kind of direction. So I believe in free speech, but not that kind of speech that, radicalizes young people into committing crimes in real life and also engage in very destructive behaviors towards their own peers online as well, because that's happening at alarming, higher and higher rates too.
There's a growing sentiment that, and I see it and I hear it all the time, that young boys and young men are being softened by this approach to, dig into your feelings, don't be ambitious, don't all these things. And for a young man who hears that, who is already so skeptical of people around him, of his ability and the space for him to actually express his emotions, and then he hears, oh, by the way, if you do that, you're going to be labeled soft because you might get laughed at. Your friends might laugh at you. The person you like might laugh at you. Your parents might reprimand you. The music star you look up to might reprimand you. What do you say to that?
This is where we need to help society in general understand the value of those emotions, all emotions other than just anger and see that as strength, not as, soft or weakness or whatever. Those are signs of strength, right? And while we're allowing ourselves to feel and exhibit and express those full range of emotions, we're actually strengthening our own mental health, our own ability to deal with stresses and crises in our lives. There's nothing soft or weak about that. That's significant strength. So we need to change the way that we talk about this as adults and really learn to value that in our own selves and in our own lives. And then as a result, help young people be comfortable with doing the same, expressing that full range of emotions. So we need more adult men, who are willing to speak about these issues in positive ways, who are willing to step up and role model that full range of emotions, not as a sign of weakness, but as a sign of strength, so that together as a society, we can move forward in helping new generations of young people take on and believe in that themselves, so that when they start to being their full authentic selves, their peers will be able to appreciate, see the value of it, rather than engaging in demeaning, humiliating, bullying kind of behaviors.
We have a lot of parents that listen and watch this podcast. What would you say to those parents who have young children who are conscious of what's happening in society and the radicalization of young boys, and they want to do something for their kids, they want to show up better? What advice would you give them?
So first of all, we need all parents, we need all Canadians to understand that this is happening, that this is a reality. The recent research that we did for our My Friend Max Hate campaign, which I encourage everybody to check out, by the way, on our website at whiteribbon.ca, we found that the majority of parents, in fact 82% or so, do not understand the manosphere, do not understand these hateful kind of ideologies and how they're being promoted online. We need parents to learn more about this, check our website, learn about how your young people, especially boys and young men, are being influenced and radicalized into these kinds of ideologies, often, without even the parents knowing. So it's really important that Canadians understand that this is happening and the kind of damaging impact that this is having on young people's lives, right? So start with that, and then start opening up, talk to your kids, talk to the boys in your life about these issues. Let them know that you know about this. Let them understand the risks, the signs of that radicalization, the reasons behind those ideologies and the influencers that are promoting them. Let them know what this is about, so that when they first experience it, when they first encounter those kinds of ideologies, they will already know that that is bad stuff that they should not be believing in or just blindly following, right? Mm-hmm. So we need parents to have these conversations with young people at younger ages, because we find that in our school system, in our education system, young people usually get exposed to this kind of education too late, in grades 7 and 8 and so forth. By that time, they already have access to tablets and phones and devices like that. They're already connecting to the online world. They're already being exposed to these kinds of ideologies. So it's too late for us to wait for our schools to promote this kind of awareness, to educate young people about this. Our schools need to start much earlier too. So everybody needs to play a role here, and we need to start teaching boys and young people, not just boys, but girls and young women about this as well much earlier. Like we do that in how we teach, for example, the basics, the foundations of math and literacy and geography, right? So why shouldn't we be teaching them in age-appropriate ways about these issues, so that they're better prepared to, once they plug into online communities, when they start gaming and when they start accessing those platforms, they are already aware of the dangers of those kinds of ideologies, rather than getting caught into it and swept into it and groomed into it. And by the time that parents realize that there's a problem, they're already deeply into those kinds of ideologies, and it's much more difficult to address at that point than if we take a proactive approach.
What's the role of women in all of this?
So women, multiple roles. So women are socialized into these kinds of stereotypes and expectations and harmful norms just as much as men are, right? When I was a boy, when I was 12 years old, my older sister would tell me, stop crying. Like, you're a grown boy now, you're going to be a man, stop crying. So, and I don't blame her for saying those things to me, because I know that women, like my sister, they grow up in this system of boys should be one way and girls should be another. It's okay for girls to express all of those emotions, right? Because it's what women are allowed to express. It's normal, but it's not okay for boys and for men to express them, right? So women grow up with those kinds of beliefs as well, and often mothers will, pass on those stereotypes and expectations to the boys in their lives. So we need to encourage women to shed those stereotypes and expectations, and together with men working together, we need to address and challenge these norms, right? So I've been working with the feminist movement and the women's movement for over 20 years. And I know when it comes to these issues, the feminist movement has been encouraging society to change, right? To see this stuff differently, to promote more safety for women and girls who are on the receiving end of these kinds of treatments, this kind of violence, right? So they've been asking for too long, often by themselves, for us to pay greater attention to this. So this is a call to action for all of us to see, gender equality as something that's good for us too, because gender equality calls for us, for men, to shed those kinds of stereotypes, those harmful norms that lead men to using violence rather than listening and rather than practicing empathy and compassion, right? The feminist movement has for too long been encouraging men to shed those kinds of expectations, to lead healthier lives, to be their authentic selves, and to treat women and others in their lives, in their families, in their communities, in their workplace as equals. I don't see that as a problem. I see that as good. If we're able to shed those stereotypes, if we're able to live in more authentic ways that allow us as men to have healthy relationships, healthy, non-violent, equal relationships with women in our lives, in our communities, in our workplaces, then that's good for us too. What's so wrong about that? So, I speak with so many men who think of feminism and women's movement as like an evil thing, and I plead to them to see feminism as a good thing.
Do they say why they think it's evil?
It's stereotypes. Women hate men. Feminists, have been working for too long because they hate men. They don't believe in men and those kinds of things. They're simple stereotypes because, we haven't always understood the meaning behind those movements, and it's good for us.
In my experience, sometimes stereotypes are based out of experience.
Sure.
And there's no doubt in my mind that a movement like feminism that supports women, there's no doubt that that's a good thing.
Yeah.
There's also a growing, and there's a rise in women who are online and very outspoken about how, and this is, I think, my favorite line. I mean, I don't like it, but I just hear it all the time, that all men are trash. And young men are seeing that and receiving that and going, okay, well, if you're a feminist and you're saying that all of us are trash, then by association, your entire movement is flawed. How do you bridge the gap between the young men who are defensive towards feminism and the movement of women because they see it as a movement that's taking something away from them? Right, wrong, it's how they feel. How do you bridge the gap between those young men and a movement that's trying to support women?
So we need to be clear about those messages are, just as we're saying that, you know, those hateful ideologies and influences are out there do not represent all men, right? There's going to be some fringe voices, some you know, unhelpful kind of statements like that all men are trash, that should not be used to paint a whole movement and a whole group of people in the same kind of brush, with the same kind of brush, right? We should not be doing that. Right? Mm-hmm. For the most part, you know, 99% of feminist leaders that I've worked with over time would never say things like that. That they would say, I care about the men in my life. I care about my sons. I'm raising sons. I have a loving, caring, supportive husband. You know, my father was an amazing role model that actually encouraged me to do the kind of movement, the advocacy that I do today. I hear those beautiful messages from women and feminist leaders. You know, predominantly that's what it is, right? The feminist movement, women's movement, cares deeply about men. Right? The goal of that movement has been, over the years, over decades now, you know, to increase the safety for women and girls, because they're on the disproportionate end of suffering, of experiencing the brunt of that violence, the brunt of that, you know, the control, the dominance, the impact of those harmful norms that so many men grow up with and end up living with in their lives, right? So women have had to organize in order to provide the programs and the services, the safety and the supports for survivors to be able to continue to live free from that violence. Everybody deserves to live free from that violence. So the movement has organized around those, you know, providing those basic safeties and needs for women. So the messaging has always been, you know, feminism is about promoting women's rights and empowerment and safety and so forth, right? But we got to look at the impact of that work as well. You know, when we are creating safer homes and relationships and workplaces and communities for women and girls, we're also improving the lives of men and boys, you know, when we do that kind of work, right?
The first time I ever went to therapy, I had a female therapist.
Yeah.
There wasn't a fit. Just like when you're looking for doctors or whatever.
Yeah.
So I went to another one, and I found another one, and another one, and I noticed very quickly that all of the therapists that were available to me were women. And there isn't necessarily something wrong with that, but in the time that I needed that therapy, I needed a man, because I needed someone who could understand the nuances of trying to be a modern man.
Yeah.
Is there a disconnect? I mean, you see it in the education system, you're starting to see it in the healthcare system, you see it in the therapy system, where it's a disproportionate number of women to men who are in those positions. And so when men are saying, hey, okay, I'm ready, they don't feel that there's a person on the other side of that conversation that can truly understand them.
Right. So, I mean, when it comes to seeking therapy and you know, finding the right therapist, like you that is part of the process, right? Even if all of those were men, you probably wouldn't have picked your first male therapist. Like you gotta do that, right?
Absolutely.
So first and foremost. But the fact that, you know, if we look at therapists, if we look at nurses, if we look at junior kindergarten teachers, they're predominantly women, right? And why is that? Because of those gender stereotypes and expectations that I've been talking about, right? That we grow up with those kinds of messages. You know, women are taught that their responsibility is to care for others, to help others, right? Men are taught that you're going to be a breadwinner. You're going to go out into the world. You're going to try to make as much money as possible. And by the way, these are the kinds of, you know, careers and roles that are sort of expected of men to take on, right?
Careers that really take away from their lives. They're like high stress finance and law. And,
right. So we see an overrepresentation of women in caring professions like nursing, like, you know, elementary school teachers, like therapists, right? And then overrepresentation of men, law enforcement, you know, legal professions. You know, when it comes to medical health care, we see men overrepresented in roles like surgeons, right? Specialists, right? Where women are overrepresented in lower paying kinds of roles, in more like direct health, caregiving kind of roles, right? So what you just described is an unfortunate outcome of how those systems of norms and gender stereotypes and expectations work in our society and in our lives. So ideally, you would have had an equal number of access to male, therapists and female therapists, and then you would choose based on best fit. And, and I'm sure that there's many women therapists out there who are well aware and equipped to support men around these questions as well.
The one I settled on was incredible.
There we go.
And it was a lady. She was great.
Yeah.
It was just that notice, years later, as I was reflecting on it, noticing, I'm like, was that an issue for me? Because I still sought out support from other men in that time of need.
And it's okay to do that, right? Like, it's okay to do that. We all need good role models in our lives, right? We certainly learn a lot from our parents, our mothers and our fathers, and many of us look for that kind of role model, that kind of male influence in our lives, for various reasons. And it's okay to do that, as long as we continue to be open to experience, our full humanity in healthy ways, that we don't restrict ourselves, that we don't look just for men, role models who model that kind of strict definition of what it means to be a man. We need to look up to men who do a great job at showing emotional intelligence, who do a great job at practicing in their day-to-day life a full range of healthy emotions, who show empathy and compassion, all of those things, rather than just the man, the model who is stoic, who sees strength as in a sense of physical strength only, who sees strength as the ability to control and dominate others. Like, we gotta challenge that kind of notion, that kind of model of being, because it's not healthy for us.
So let's talk practicality here.
Yeah.
If I'm a young man who is cognizant and aware that I'm struggling with how I'm seeing the world, I feel like I'm in isolation, I'm finding more community and belonging online in these chat groups and these male influencers and their communities and whatnot, but I know that it's not right, I know it doesn't feel right, but I don't really there's no alternative options, and by some luck they stumble upon this conversation. What do you want them to hear? How do they get out of that?
I want them to hear that we understand their pain, we understand their feeling of loneliness, feeling of isolation, of not having anybody to talk to. We understand how, in real life, in schools and at home, things may not be going well. They may not be able to find support in that. Amongst their peers or their parents or their family members. A lot of the young men who get drawn into these kinds of ideologies have those kinds of experiences. The majority of them are seeking purpose, are seeking belonging and support, and they're not finding it in real life. So I want those young men to know that they're valued, that they are important, that they deserve, to live a healthy life, deserve to belong, deserve to be their real selves, their full selves, that they deserve support, and I encourage them to reach out to White Ribbon, whiteribbon.ca, learn more about our programming. There's lots of resources on there to help to help them, get connected to community supports. There's lots of organizations like White Ribbon who provide direct counseling programming for them. A lot of young men are involved in these ideologies and are looking for a way out as well, and don't always know where to go for help. So reach out to our website, check out our resources, our referrals, connect to someone in your local community, talk to a guidance counselor, talk to an adult that you trust, open up with them, let them know how you're feeling and what you need, and the kinds of supports that you're looking for. But disconnect from these ideologies. They're not helping you, even though they're saying, they're there to support you to be a better man and so forth. That is not what they're doing. They're what the kind of masculinity that these ideologies are promoting is deeply problematic. It's deeply harmful for the lives of boys and young men and adult men.
And to the women out there, obviously White Ribbon, one of White Ribbon's main missions is to support victims of gender-based violence or of domestic violence. If there's someone who's listening to this, watching this, who is in some unfortunate situation where they're dealing with that and they're on the receiving end, they are being victimized, what resources, supports, what can they do to extract themselves from those situations?
Yeah, I want to tell, survivors, women, and some men too, who find themselves in situations like that, and boys and young men who are experiencing abuse too, and who are being exploited. I want to send the same message too, that they matter, that they deserve to be treated safely, with respect, with care, with empathy and compassion. They don't deserve to be experiencing the violence that they're experiencing, the pain and all of that. And that there are many organizations, many groups who will support in similar ways, reach out to a helpline, and get connected to local supports organizations, shelters, women's community groups, who can provide some initial support, some ideas, talk to someone that you trust as well, talk to a family member. And for family members out there, reach out to folks that you think may need help, and listen, primarily listen, let them know that you're there to support them. A lot of folks often think that they just need to get people out from violent situations, but that's not always the answer. That's not always helpful. That it takes survivors a long time to be able to walk away from a relationship. There's often kids involved. There's financial dependencies. There's bigger factors that keep women in particular stuck in those violent relationships, and they need support. They need someone to be there to listen, to be compassionate, to share empathy, and to say, when you're ready to leave, you can count on me. Let me know. I'll come and help you. I'll support you. I'm here for you, right? So sharing those kinds of positive, supportive messages without judgment, without pressure is really important, because when a survivor feels like they're surrounded by support, then they're more likely to be able to walk away from those kinds of violent situations.
Which I have two thoughts here, which is, firstly, it's interesting that you say, when they feel like they have a support base, it encourages them more. They feel more prepared to walk away from that situation. I can only imagine how isolating that must feel when, if you go to a friend or a family member and you say, hey, this is happening, and they go, okay, so just leave. Why are you still in it? And then there's all those little nuances that you talked about, financial dependencies, children, fear, anything like that. And then they don't. And then that friend or family member almost starts to judge them.
That's right. And
criticize them. And they no longer feel like they're fighting two fronts, being judged by here, but also being abused over here. Like, I can only imagine how awful awful.
It's very, very much so. And, it's one of the reasons why women don't reach out for help is because of that fear, because of the stigma, the shame, right? And I want to, remind everyone that a woman, anybody who has to leave their home, their family home because of violence becomes homeless, even if they have a shelter to go to.
Yeah.
They're homeless, right? So becoming homeless is a really difficult step to take when you're living in a violent situation. And so for family members, for friends, for coworkers, colleagues, everybody around that person, it's really important to keep that in mind. Because when you're telling someone to leave a violent relationship, you're basically telling them that they're going to become homeless. And often, survivors need to leave those violent situations with their children. So it's not just them becoming homeless, it's their children becoming homeless as well. And I don't want to, leave your audience with the idea that, survivors should stay. Of course not. But it's, the ideal will be for that violence to end. So we also have to think about, what do we do with a person that's using violence, right? And often we focus on supporting the survivor, and rightly so, but we also need to turn our attention to the person who's using violence, because that needs to stop, right? Sure. And we often don't always reach out to that person and say, I know what's happening, I'm here to support you, what can I do to help you stopping to use your, violence? And I find, through the work that I do in the Ontario government's Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, where I take a look at these cases of fatalities involved in intimate partner violence, I often see situations where there were plenty of opportunities for people to intervene with the perpetrators before that violence escalated to a point of a life being lost, or often multiple lives being lost. And so the focus is often on supporting the survivors and getting them away from that violent kind of situation. But very little is done with the perpetrator, with the men in particular, predominantly men who are using that violence. And that violence continues to escalate. Even when we try to get women and children away from those kinds of situations, often that violence still escalates. That leads to, loss of death. So we have to do a better job intervening earlier and connecting with people who are using violence, and intervening in supportive and healthier kinds of ways as well. Just sending them to jail is not sufficient. They need the kinds of therapy and support to help them deal with their own inability to deal with anger, to deal with their frustrations, their loss, their grief, often unresolved trauma from earlier years as well. Those men are not getting the necessary kind of supports to help them end the use of their violence. We gotta pay attention to that too.
I almost feel like we can have an entire conversation just about that process.
Yeah.
My mind automatically assumes just toss these guys in prison, get them away as far and wide as possible. But you're saying it doesn't work, and I'm like, I know it wouldn't work, because it doesn't actually solve anything. It just basically removes them from one situation and puts them in another, where whatever was manifesting within them that's resulting in this external aggression is only going to be compounded and magnified in a place like prison.
Yeah, exactly.
And on the flip side, again, because I love to play devil's advocate here, the counter argument could be, but who's to say that these people can be healed or fixed or whatnot, and now we're going to leave them on the streets, still potentially abusing someone while they go to therapy once a week for 1 hour? Like, what's the trade-off here?
Yeah.
And
it's not an easy solution.
I can imagine. But the other comment, or the other thought I wanted to share was, when you mentioned survivors can also be men, I wanted to say that I've had on previous guests, some of whom you would never, just by looking at them, assume. And they've expressed to me, I won't name them, but they've expressed to me that they've been victims as well. And when you see like their partner and you're like, that person did that to you, it really just takes away the whole like physical, because this man is like 6 foot and his partner was like 5 foot, like that changes the no, it doesn't in some scenarios. And I think it's important to also recognize that men can also be victims of domestic abuse, sexual abuse, and those kinds of things as well.
All of those things. Yeah, like even in context, for example, the military, right? We know that the majority of victims who've experienced sexual assault and harassment in our military in Canada have been women, but lots of men have come forward as well, saying that they too have experienced that kind of violence. And so we got to shed those kinds of stereotypes and understand that still, women and girls have, they've experienced that violence in disproportionate ways. When you look at the overall statistics, you see women and girls overrepresented in those numbers, but the men are there too. Childhood sexual abuse survivors, family violence survivors, young men nowadays we see that are being experiencing sextortion online, right? The vast majority of the victims of sextortion in Canada are boys and young men. Teenagers. And
sextortion is what?
Sextortion exactly? is when someone, for example, posing to be a beautiful young woman online starts connecting with your teenage son through social media, through Snapchat or one of those gaming sites, and all of a sudden they're exchanging intimate images, and that person really is a con artist. Usually other men will blackmail the teenage boy, will say things like, I'm gonna now share all of these images, intimate images that you shared with me, with your family, with your principal, with your friends, unless you give me $5,000. So there's that kind of dynamic happening right now in our tech platforms, and again the alarms are being raised because this is creating significant problems for young men who are then dealing with this kind of situation in very drastic ways. They're deeply ashamed. They're afraid to reach out for help. They fall further and further victim to the attempts, the extortion attempts by these individuals. And we've seen some pretty high profile cases of young men taking their lives because they're no longer able to deal with that kind of abuse, right? So we have to keep that in mind. We have to encourage those boys and young men to reach out to adults that they trust and to come forward and to get help, and for the adults to be to be paying attention to those kinds of experiences and to be there and to support those young men as they come forward. So we know that that's happening. Men in adult relationships will experience various forms of violence and poor treatment as well, and they too deserve to be supported. Nobody deserves to live with violence in their lives, violence of any kind. So we have to break the silence around this, because many people feel like they deal with these kinds of experiences in silence because they don't see themselves represented in the discourse and in sort of the awareness around these issues. Yeah.
Well, I really, really appreciate the work that you and your organization do. I thank you for coming here and spending your time with me and sharing all of this. This is, I have a lot of conversations on this podcast. These are some of my favorite because they're meaningful conversations about real life work, if that makes sense. Yeah. And you have a lifelong supporter now of White Ribbon and the work that your team does. And I thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for your service to our community and to victims everywhere. And just know on the days where, because I know I've worked with charities, I've worked for charities, I know that there are days where you're just like, I put in so much and I'm not sure what the return is. Just know that there is a return there. So
thank you.
Thank you for doing what you're doing.
Thank you for your support, and thank you for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everybody.